All righty, good evening tonight. It is September 18th, 2025. My name is Matthew Underwood. We're going to be giving you a great show tonight. Tonight is going to be a little bit different. You know, most shows that I do, they're going to be kind of current events, news shows, but I want to do one show a week where I tackle some sort of historical topic. I've got an idea for what that's going to be tonight. I'm going to get into that in just a moment. But once a night a week, I'm going to be tackling some sort of historical event, historical topic, because personally, I love history, and I think there's a great quote. I don't know who it's attributed to. This is why I should have someone researching these videos. I should have a producer, but hey, I'm just doing this. I'm just starting out on my own. I'm just doing my spiel here, so I don't have any of that stuff. But there is a great quote, and again, I don't know who it's attributed to, who says that history doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme. I think it's very true. So, if we want to learn the context of what we're living in today, we want to look back on the past. And so tonight is going to be one of those episodes where I'm going to be digging deep into a historical topic and kind of give you my take on it and my sort of interpretation on it. Before we even get into that, though, I want to address last night's episode that I did, because I have a few things I want to clear up regarding that episode. The general gist of my take last night was advice to the right that said, don't dive into these Charlie Kirk conspiracy theories. Don't be tempted by it. I know conspiracies are fun. I get it, but don't dive into these Charlie Kirk conspiracy theories. And I want to kind of qualify that statement a little bit better than I did last night. For those people out there who are saying Israel did it, or these billionaires did it, or Tyler Robinson was a patsy, whatever. That's who my message was aimed towards. Was don't buy into this. Look, Tyler Robinson is the shooter, okay? He was not a patsy. He was not set up. He was our guy, okay? And he was our guy, and he was a radical leftist lunatic. He was an absolute nut job. Well, again, I say nut job. He was not insane. He was perfectly sane. It's a politically motivated assassination. He was not a nut job, okay? When I was saying don't listen to these conspiracy theories, again, I'm talking about there's some hidden cabal. It's Israel. It's the Jews. It's these billionaires. It's whoever it might be that you might want to blame for this assassination. That was not the case at all, okay? The Jews didn't do it. Israel didn't do it. It wasn't some cabal of billionaires or deep state individuals. This was just a crazy leftist that killed Charlie. That's simple, okay? So that was kind of my point. That being said, I don't want to entirely dismiss a conspiracy regarding the assassination, okay? And that's not to say there's some sort of grand conspiracy that this is like JFK 2.0 and Tyler Robinson is just a patsy and anything like that. That's not what I'm saying at all. But you look at some of these Discord chats that have been released. For instance, I'll pull up. I've got the chat between Robinson and the transvestite roommate here. We've got it right here. Basically, Robinson sends this Discord chat to his transvestite roommate, and he says something along the lines of, "Did you see what happened at UVU?" Which is the university that Charlie was assassinated at. The tranny says, "Yeah, I did." And then Tyler Robinson says, look under the keyboard at my desk. The roommate does it. It's a note that's some sort of confession. And the roommate replies, "What? You're joking. You're joking, right?" Tyler Robinson, the assassin, says, "I'm still okay, my love, but I'm stuck in Orem," which is where the assassination took place. Tyler Robinson, I believe, lived like 3 or 4 hours away. He says, "I'm stuck in Orem for a little while longer yet. Like, I'll get to that in a second. Shouldn't be long till I can come home, but I got to grab my rifle still. To be honest, I had hoped to keep this secret till I died of old age. I am sorry to involve you." The tranny roommate says, "You weren't the one who did it, right?" He says, "I am. I'm sorry." Then the roommate says, I thought they caught the person. Tyler Robinson says, no, they grabbed some crazy old dude. They interrogated someone in similar clothing. I had planned to grab my rifle from my drop point shortly after, but most of that side of town had gotten locked down. It's quiet, almost enough to get out of here, but there's one vehicle lingering. It goes on like this. The chats are just weird. You know, it doesn't sound like anyone would chat with each other. It's strange. And to me, my takeaway from this is if you ever watch Breaking Bad, there's one of the greatest scenes in the entire show where Hank, Walt's brother-in-law, sorry, spoilers, it's been out for 10 years at this point. If you haven't seen it yet, then my apologies, but it's been out for a decade. But Hank, Walt's brother-in-law, who's the main character, he's the teacher that goes and cooks meth and becomes a criminal. He gets murdered by these criminal associates of Walt. And Walt, they know now that he's a drug dealer, and they're after him. He's on the run, and he calls his wife, Skylar, and basically just cusses her out and bitches her out and says, you never believed in me. You always tried to hold me back. I was trying to support this family by selling drugs, and you always tried to stop me. And it was basically a way for Walt to absolve his wife of any guilt. And so that she would avoid going to prison as an accomplice, because at that point she had become an accomplice in the show. She was helping launder his drug money. And so he leaves this long, he has this long, rant at her that is designed to absolve her guilt. That's what this feels like to me. I've just got it on my phone right here. The Discord chat, and I won't go through it all. To me, it feels like this is Tyler Robinson absolving his trainee girlfriend of any sort of guilt. Or trainee boyfriend, okay? I misspoke there. This was a man that Tyler Robinson was sleeping with. He was a homosexual. His partner was transitioning to female, quote unquote, obviously, because that's all bullshit. We all know that, but I misspoke in saying girlfriend. But I read these Discord chats, and it's not just with the trainee boyfriend, but you have Tyler Robinson's friends, his fellow leftist gamer retard friends, which, by the way, nothing wrong with gamers. I'm a gamer myself. I love gamers. Actually, a side note, I saw Tyler Robinson, someone leaked his his Steam account, and I had to do like a double take. Half of the games he plays on there, I was playing myself. So look, gamers, I absolve you here. Any other fellow gamers, I absolve you guys. Tyler is not one of us, but he did happen to be playing some of our favorite games, unfortunately. But he was in a Discord chat with these other lefty retard, blue-haired, nose-ringed cunts. And they messaged something on the day of the shooting when Charlie got assassinated. And they say something like, whoa, what happened here? And they're like, damn, rip Charlie Kirk. I didn't agree with him, but he didn't deserve that. Just standard kind of, you don't agree with him, but you have sympathetic talking points, whatever. And then it's like the next day when Tyler Robinson gets arrested, he says, I'm turning myself in. I was the one that did it at UVU, yada, yada, yada. And that's all the text we have from that Discord chat. To me, now again, there is not some grand conspiracy here. And that was the whole point of my episode last night, was there is not some sort of grand conspiracy. It's not Israel. It's not the Jews. It's not billionaires. It's not the deep state. It's not any of these whatever, people want to go to. It's not what killed Tyler Robinson. And or not what killed Charlie Kirk, rather. Sorry, I misspoke again. That's not what killed Charlie Kirk. Don't go down those rabbit holes. Not that you shouldn't question things. Again, you should question everything, especially that comes from the government. But this is a clear-cut radical leftist who committed this murder. However, I might have been a little too broad when I said ignore the conspiracies, because I think there may be, in fact, a conspiracy here. And that conspiracy is among Robinson and his trainee, roommate, partner, romantic partner, and his lefty loony friends. We should be demanding those full Discord chats. And not only those full Discord chats, but there should be investigations into everyone that was involved in those Discord chats. Because if you think that this guy was acting alone, I do not buy that. It's not to say, again, it's not to say that he was part of some grand conspiracy that spanned the globe and he was just a patsy set up by nefarious actors who wanted to silence Charlie, whatever. No. But there is a conspiracy here. And that conspiracy is amongst Tyler Robinson and his tranny roommate and his little faggot lefty friends. Investigate them all. Investigate everyone that was in the Discord chats with him. Investigate everyone he was friends with on Reddit. Investigate everyone he was friends with on social media, period. Investigate them all, because I guarantee you a lot of these people had prior knowledge. Just based off of what I'm looking at on the Discord chats, they seem very suspicious. It's hard for me to believe that he simply decided, I'm going to do this on my own 1 week in advance. He stole his grandpa's gun, went down there, and shot Charlie. No. He talked about this with his friends. He talked about this with his lover, gay roommate. He talked about this with a lot of people. There was foreknowledge. I guarantee it. Not amongst a vast conspiracy of important deep state billionaires, whatever it might be. Israel, I know it's been out there. That's not the conspiracy I'm saying there was. And I would encourage you not to go down that rabbit hole, because our enemy is the left. Charlie Kirk was murdered by the radical left. It is that simple. That being said, there is a conspiracy here, I believe, but it was not some grand conspiracy. It was a conspiracy among Tyler Robinson and his crazy lefty friends. And that should be investigated more. So I did just want to kind of touch on that before I get into tonight's main topic, because I was a little bit too broad last night when I was saying don't believe the conspiracy theories. I agree with that statement still today when it comes to the grand conspiracies. Like I said, Tyler Robinson is our guy. He is our shooter. He was the sole assassin of Charlie Kirk in terms of who pulled the trigger. That being said, even though he was the one that pulled the trigger, it is hard for me to believe that his transvestite lover roommate did not have foreknowledge. It is hard for me to believe that his buddies on Discord, his leftist lunatics on Discord, did not have prior knowledge. Everything that I see looks like an attempt to absolve them of any guilt. It is a Walter White calling Skylar White after he's already dead to rights. And that is what it seems like to me, personally. So that's not to say there isn't a conspiracy theory. There is, but it's not a grand conspiracy amongst foreign countries or billionaires or the deep state or whatever. It's not that. This was the left that did this. Tyler Robinson was a radical leftist, and he killed Charlie Kirk because he was a leftist psycho, period. But I think there are a lot more leftist psychos who knew about this, knew it was going to happen, and were tacitly supportive of it, and were fine with their friend Tyler Robinson taking that shot and killing Charlie Kirk. So that is what I will kind of just start off with, just to kind of clear up some of the things that I had said last night. But moving on, the bigger topic that I want to get into tonight is, again, I think one night a week, I'm going to do a more historically centered show where I'm going to be talking about events from history. And again, I did my first video. It was Friday, September 12th of 25. That was 2 days after Charlie was assassinated. And of course, at the time, I had to go into the Charlie Kirk assassination. I had to give my take on that. That was the event that woke me up to start doing this every night. So that was, of course, what had to be the topic of the day. And that is exactly what I went into. That being said, of course, it was September 12th, the day after 9/11. And so tonight, I've been thinking about this topic a lot lately, and I kind of want to do a deep dive on 9/11 and bin Laden. Just kind of give you my own historiography of it and just take you through the story of what went there and clear up a lot of the mistruths or the lies that we know or think we know about 9/11, the narratives that have been fed to us about 9/11. And some of this will be obvious to people. Now, I will start off by saying, above all else, I'm not a 9/11 truther. This was done by Al Qaeda. It was done by bin Laden. I'm not a conspiracy theorist on 9/11 whatsoever. So when I say clearing up some of the lies, I'm not going to be threading some 9/11 truther web that Bush did it or whatever the theory is out there. I'm not a 9/11 truther again. I'm not a conspiracy theorist on 9/11. 9/11 was committed by Al Qaeda. It was committed by bin Laden. But outside of that, there are a lot of sort of mistruths or misunderstandings, I should say, about 9/11, about who bin Laden was, about why he did what he did. And a lot of that has just kind of gone out the window or gone on the ether, and people don't really think about it too much. So obviously 9/11 was 1 week ago. And of course, my first video, I was talking about Charlie. Last night, I want to do some current events stuff. But because going forward, I want to devote one night every week to some sort of historical topic, with it being, I know I'm a week late, but with it being the 24th anniversary of 9/11 7 days ago, I do want to kind of devote a little episode to, again, 9/11 and bin Laden. So kind of tell you the story of that. And I think in order to tell you the story of 9/11, you have to start with the man who was principally responsible for the September 11th attacks. And that, of course, was bin Laden. Now, before I get into bin Laden, the other reason, other than just 9/11, the 24th anniversary being pretty recent, the other reason why I wanted to get into 9/11 as a general topic tonight is because when I did that video the day after 9/11, September 12th, Friday last week, I had said that Charlie Kirk's assassination was our generation's 9/11, my generation's 9/11. And I got a little bit of heat for that, for saying that, because obviously, look, Charlie Kirk is just one man. On 9/11, 3,000 Americans were killed. Now, obviously, the death toll and the human cost of 9/11 was much, much greater than the assassination of Charlie Kirk. By far. I mean, it's not even close. Thousands of people died on 9/11. One person was murdered when Charlie Kirk was assassinated. So there's obviously a massive difference in human cost there. The point that I was making when I was comparing the two, and it's a point that I stand by, was that, 9/11 was targeting America in general. America as an empire. But when Charlie Kirk was assassinated, engaging in free speech, engaging in free debate, open public discourse, I mean, the most fundamental American political values you can think of, and he was murdered for that, for doing exactly that. I felt that was in some ways a greater attack on what it means to be an American, on the American way of life, than 9/11 was, because you were murdering someone for executing their most fundamental First Amendment rights, whereas 9/11, bin Laden was not killing people for exercising their First Amendment rights or whatever. He was launching a terror attack on the American empire in order to provoke a specific response in terms of our foreign policy. Bin Laden was not attempting to change what it means to be an American. He was not attempting to silence Americans for speaking their minds freely. He was attempting to provoke a change in American foreign policy to his own benefit. So that's why I said, in some ways, the Charlie Kirk assassination was worse than 9/11, because even though one man died versus 3,000 people died, when Charlie Kirk was assassinated, it was an attack on the most fundamental things that make us American. Whereas when 9/11 took place, it was an attack on the nation as a whole, but in order to provoke a change in American foreign policy, whereas the Kirk assassination was designed to silence people, to prevent them from exercising their fundamental First Amendment rights, which in some ways, again, is a much bigger attack on what it means to be an American. And that's the point that I was making. I stand by that. That's not to say that 9/11 wasn't a tragedy. It's not to say that 9/11 wasn't much, much greater, obviously, in human cost. Thousands of people lost their lives compared to one person when Charlie was assassinated. So it's not to say there's a moral, I mean, you know, murder took place either way. So there is a degree of moral equivalence, but many, many more people obviously were killed in 9/11 than when Charlie was killed, because it was just one person when he was assassinated. So I don't want to say there's an equivalence there, because one was far worse in terms of a human cost. My point was just, there is a degree of, like, when Charlie was assassinated, it was a much more fundamental attack on what it means to be an American, versus where 9/11 was really designed to change American foreign policy. It wasn't an attack on the First Amendment. Charlie's assassination was an attack on the First Amendment. 9/11 was just an attack on the nation writ large, again, in order to provoke a change in American foreign policy. So kind of just because I wanted to talk about something historical, and 9/11 was last week, and I also want to kind of respond to some of the criticism that I got during that first video for comparing Charlie's assassination to 9/11. I wanted to tonight do a deep dive on, again, bin Laden and 9/11. Excuse me, I need to wet my beak a little bit. So, obviously, in order to understand 9/11, you have to understand the man who was principally responsible for it, who, of course, is bin Laden. So, there's often this is kind of one of the first big lies of 9/11, or not really lies, because I don't think anyone is doing this intentionally, but just kind of misnomers, bad opinions regarding bin Laden and regarding 9/11. And of course, everyone has this image of bin Laden of being this crazy religious fundamentalist with a big long beard who lived in a cave and was basically just this backwards barbarian. And he did live in the cave, for a good portion of his life. He lived in hideouts and caves in the mountains of Afghanistan. He was certainly a religious fundamentalist. He was a radical, Islamic fundamentalist. He had a big long beard, all that caricature. It's not exactly wrong, but it makes you think of him as someone who's primitive. It makes you think of him as some backwards goat herder who didn't know his ass from a hole in the ground. It makes you think of bin Laden as someone who was just some backwards, uncivilized, which of course he was uncivilized. He was a mass murderer, but it makes you think of him as just some backwards, like I said, goat herder, someone who came out of the 10th century. And that is not the way to think of bin Laden at all. At all, okay? Bin Laden was a genius. He was a genius. An evil genius, don't get me wrong, but he was a genius. He was an evil genius. You should not think of bin Laden as some backwards, primitive barbarian. You should think of bin Laden as a Bond villain. And that's who he really was. He was a supervillain. He was a Bond villain. He was like Lex Luthor or Goldfinger, okay? He was a movie villain. He was a supervillain, is who bin Laden was. And again, this is not condoning what he did at all. I'm not a fan of bin Laden whatsoever. I want to make that very clear. He was a very, very evil man. But that is not to deny that he was an evil genius. There's a lot of evil men who were very, very intelligent. And bin Laden was extremely intelligent. And not only that, he was extremely modern. Again, this idea of him being some sort of backwards goat herder from the 10th century is not accurate. Do not think of bin Laden in those terms. Think of bin Laden as a Bond villain. He was Dr. No. He was Blofeld. He was Goldfinger, okay? He was a Bond villain. So, to kind of just give a deep dive. So, bin Laden grew up. First off, I'll be referring to him as bin Laden, but bin Laden is his family name. And in order to understand who he was, you have to understand what the bin Laden family was. Bin Laden's father, it was either his grandfather or his father, I believe his father, was one of the most successful business people of the 20th century. I believe it was his father, but it might have been his grandfather. Basically was close with Ibn Saud. which Ibn Saud was the first king of Saudi Arabia. He was one of many tribal desert warlords in Arabia who united Saudi Arabia in the 1920s and formed the modern kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And he was the first king of Saudi Arabia, was Ibn Saud. And Ibn Saud was close with, I believe, bin Laden's father, although it might have been bin Laden's grandfather. And when oil was discovered in Saudi Arabia started pouring those oil revenues into rapidly modernizing the country. Of course, we all know today, yes, Saudi Arabia is a very religiously fundamentalist country. You know, it's a place where up until recently women couldn't even drive. I mean, it's a country where it's an authoritarian country. It's under Sharia law. We all know that. It's a very deeply religious nation. And when oil was discovered in the country, they didn't want foreign investors, Western non-Islamic investors, going into Saudi Arabia to develop the country, because before oil was discovered in Saudi Arabia, it might have been the most underdeveloped country on earth. I mean, that is not even an exaggeration. I mean, Saudi Arabia was basically the most worthless piece of real estate on the planet. It was a barren desert with nothing there. I mean, a barren desert with absolutely nothing there. No resources. You couldn't grow any food. The few people that lived there were these Bedouin Arabs who basically were constantly warring with each other. They would move from well to well to well, and it was just a nightmare. The only sort of economically viable part of Saudi Arabia was on the western side of the country, the western coast along the Red Sea, where Mecca and Medina are located, which are the two most holy sites in Islam. Mecca being the most holy site, and where Muslims every year in the tens of thousands, if not the millions, engage in the Hajj, which is one of the sacraments of Islam, where you're supposed to, if you're able to and you have the money, you have to go visit Mecca at least once in your life and pray at the mosque in Mecca, the Kaaba, which is the Kaaba itself is not the mosque. It's the black cube. If you ever seen the black cube structure in Mecca, it's the holiest site in Islam. And that was really, if there's anything that was economically viable, it was in that eastern region, because you could make money off of pilgrims going to the Hajj every year, and there were mountains there. So there are no rivers in Saudi Arabia, but the small, tiny bit of precipitation that they get comes in that eastern side of the country. The few little parts where you can grow a little bit of food are in that eastern section of Saudi Arabia. And that was not even the Saudi homeland. The Saudis were from the western, or I'm sorry, Mecca and Medina are in the western part. The Saudis were from the eastern part of Saudi Arabia. And the eastern part of Saudi Arabia along the Persian Gulf is just sand dunes. It's just desert. It's desolate desert. And it was legitimately probably the most underdeveloped country on planet Earth at the time that it was ruthlessly unified by Ibn Saud, the first king of Saudi Arabia. So bin Laden's, I believe, father, although it might have been his grandfather, was in some way connected to Ibn Saud. He was friends with them, and he was friends with a lot of his sons and the Saudi princes. And when oil was discovered, Ibn Saud and his successors, his sons who were his successors, every king of Saudi Arabia up to this point is a son of the first king of Saudi Arabia, Ibn Saud. And they all wanted to rapidly modernize the country. I mean, of course, today, again, even though Saudi Arabia is a very Islamic fundamentalist country, it is a very modern country. I mean, it's some of the best infrastructure in the world exists in Saudi Arabia. Some of the tallest buildings exist in Saudi Arabia. I mean, they're building right now this Neom city that the Crown Prince is building. It's like this, it's the Line City, where it's like glass walls that go for miles, and there's a whole city that he's trying to build in it. You know, the money there is insane, obviously. We all know that the Saudis are incredibly, ridiculously wealthy, and all that money comes from oil. I mean, they don't innovate anything. They don't create anything. All their money comes from their vast, vast oil resources. And when they started bringing in that oil money in the late 1930s, really it didn't kick off until after World War II. Oil was discovered originally in Saudi Arabia in, I believe, 1936. It was the mid-1930s. But oil exploitation in Saudi Arabia didn't really take off until after World War II. And it really starts with there was a meeting during World War II where President Roosevelt had just attended the Yalta Conference, which the Yalta Conference was one of those final conferences between Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin. In fact, it was the final conference featuring Roosevelt, because he would die shortly thereafter, and then the final sort of conference of World War II between those three Allied powers that would kind of settle the borders in Europe was the Potsdam Conference, held outside of Berlin after the fall of the Nazi regime in Germany. And that was attended by Truman, because Truman had already succeeded the presidency after Roosevelt. He had already died. But Yalta was just before that. And I believe early 1945, it might have been late 1944, though. But Yalta was held in Crimea, which is in Ukraine, off the Black Sea. And Roosevelt makes the long trip around by boat, around the Horn of Africa, up the Red Sea, through the Suez Canal, through the Dardanelles, through Turkey, and up to Yalta, which at the time was part of the Soviet Union, and holds the Yalta Conference with Stalin, with Churchill. Well, on Roosevelt's return journey, he stops in the middle of the Suez Canal. And he has a famous meeting with Ibn Saud. Now, at the time, there were really only a handful of places in the world where you could actually drill for oil. Texas, Mexico, Venezuela, Persia, Indonesia, and the Caucasus region of Russia, basically modern day like Azerbaijan and southern Russia around the Caucasus Mountains. Those are really the only places in the world where there were proven oil reserves. Until around that time, you had just found massive proven oil reserves in Saudi Arabia. Now, around the time that this meeting in the Suez Canal between Ibn Saud and Roosevelt takes place, the Battle of the Bulge was taking place. So the Battle of the Bulge was sort of Hitler's last stand. The Allies are pushing in from the west. France had already been liberated at this point. The Soviets were pushing in from the east. Even Warsaw had already been liberated at this point. And, it was the end stages of Nazi Germany. They were going to lose the war, but Hitler, in his crazed madness, would not give up. He would not throw in the towel, even though it was done. And so, as sort of a last-ditch, insane effort to win the war, Hitler sends this massive offensive in the middle of the winter under cloud cover so that the Allied air superiority couldn't play a major role through Belgium, try to sweep through Belgium, and then take the port of Antwerp, cut off a large portion of the Allied forces, surround them, destroy them, hopefully negotiate a peace with the Western Allies so he could turn the full force of the German army against the invading Russians. It was a batshit crazy plan. But as crazy as the plan was, at least initially, it worked. The German panzers, the Tiger tanks, they broke through the Allied lines and really started pushing on forward. They were probably going to win that because the cloud cover that was preventing our air cover, our air superiority from playing a role against the Germans was, preventing us from seeing where the hell the Germans were. I mean, this is before radar, this is before guided weapons. You needed clear skies in order to fight in the skies. And there were no clear skies during this time because it was the middle of winter, from the winter of like 44, 45. And the Germans looked like they're going to actually go all the way to the coast and cut a massive portion of the Allied armies off. And what ends up happening is the Tiger tanks, which no one could take out. I mean, the Tiger tanks that Germany deployed during World War II, they were indestructible. No one could take them out. They get stuck in the snow. They run out of fuel. And so Franklin Roosevelt, leaves the Yalta Conference convinced America can never be in the position that Germany was in the Battle of the Bulge. We can never lose a battle because we run out of oil. Now, America had large stockpiles of oil at the time. Had a lot of access to Mexican oil as well, which is a big producer of oil at the time. The Venezuelans were producing a lot of oil at the time. However, obviously the Caucasus were controlled by the Soviets, so America wouldn't have access to that. The Persian oil fields were already monopolized by the British, so the U.S. wouldn't have access to that. And the oil fields in what is today Malaysia and Indonesia and the island of Borneo were under Japanese occupation at the time. But once Japan was defeated, they would revert back to the British and Dutch colonizers of the region. And so Roosevelt decided we have to find some sort of source of oil that is going to be untouchable, that will guarantee that what happened to the Germans in the Battle of the Bulge never happens to the United States. So he has this famous meeting with Ibn Saud in the Suez Canal in 1945, leaving from the Yalta Conference. And a deal is struck there. And the essential deal is America will provide to the Saudi royal family specifically. The United States of America will defend the Saudi royal family in perpetuity from both threats foreign and domestic. We will ensure, no matter what happens going forward, the United States will defend the Saudi royal family and will ensure that the Saudi royal family stays in control in Saudi Arabia. And in exchange, the United States will always have access to Saudi oil. That was the essential part of the deal. And it's after that, after World War II, that the Saudi oil boom really takes place. And then 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, Saudi Arabia goes from being, again, literally the most underdeveloped nation on planet Earth to being the modern marvel that it is today. And again, it's a very religiously backwards, socially backwards, but it's infrastructure. It's, it is a completely first world modern country in terms of just the wealth there, the infrastructure, the standard of living there is extremely high. And that is all off the oil money that came rolling in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Well, as that oil money came rolling in, Saudi Arabia, the Saudi royal family, needed someone to build all these new roads, all these new bridges, all these new buildings, these sewage systems, water systems, utilities, power, everything. And that is where the bin Laden family came in. So I believe it was bin Laden's father, although it might have been his grandfather, founded a construction firm in Saudi Arabia. And because the patriarch of the bin Laden clan was close with Ibn Saud and his sons and the Saudi royal family, they started getting all the contracts to build all of these infrastructure projects in Saudi Arabia, which was fueled by the oil money. The bin Laden family to this day still owns the company, the Saudi bin Laden Group, which is one of the largest construction firms on the planet. It is not an understatement to say that in Saudi Arabia, second only to the Saudi royal family is the bin Laden family in terms of wealth and influence and prestige and power. They are the richest people in the country outside of the royal family themselves. This royal family governs the country. They have all the oil wealth, but the bin Laden family built Saudi Arabia. Just as much as the royal family, again, controls the oil wealth, they govern the country, the bin Ladens built the country. So Osama bin Laden grew up basically as close to being a Saudi prince as one can possibly be without being a Saudi prince. And if you know anything about the Saudi royal family, you know that the Saudi princes, there are hundreds, probably thousands of them. Because all these Saudis, they have multiple wives and they have, dozens of children. And bin Laden's father was very much the same way. Had dozens and dozens of wives, had dozens and dozens of children. Bin Laden, one of many of them, okay? And he basically grew up as a Saudi prince. I mean, he was a rich guy. He was a rich little kid. And more than that, in his young age, he was a playboy. I mean, yes, he was somewhat religious. In Saudi Arabia, everyone has to be a little bit religious. But he wasn't really that religious, bin Laden was. In his early days, he got a Western education, didn't have that big, long, crazy, scraggly beard. He was just, kind of a playboy. He drank. He partied. There are stories of him in his 20s where he would go to Beirut, which at the time before the Lebanese Civil War was kind of like they called it the Paris of the Middle East. There were, bars and clubs. There were even gay bars in Beirut at the time, just to describe how liberal it was and how kind of outgoing it was. Beirut at the time in Lebanon. Of course, it's not that way today. The country is essentially run by Lebanon, or by Hezbollah, rather. Lebanon is essentially run by Hezbollah. But at the time, it was considered the Paris of the Middle East. And bin Laden would go there a lot, and he would hang out with his friends, he'd get drunk, and he was just living it up. He was a rich prince, basically. I mean, bin Laden was worth something like $50 million in his lifetime, and that didn't come from his own business ventures. He was born with that money. I mean, he was born basically as close to being royalty as you possibly could be without actually being royalty. That was bin Laden. He was erudite. He had a Western education. He was extremely wealthy, like I said, and was just born into it. I mean, he was a what do they call them? Nepo babies, basically, is what bin Laden was. He was a scion. He was a prince. He was as close to being a Saudi prince without being a Saudi prince. Then somewhere in his 20s, bin Laden, I don't really know why, but somewhere he became very, very religious. And he gave up this life of kind of being a rich playboy and devoted his life to Islam and became extremely religious. And it was around this time that you had the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which was a major, major event. People don't remember just how big of a deal this was, because when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, it was a massive upheaval in established foreign policy for basically a decade at that point. So under Nixon and Kissinger, who Nixon was, of course, the president from 69 to 74 when he was overthrown in Watergate. I will do a video on Watergate later on. But Nixon was the president. Henry Kissinger, was Secretary of State and National Security Advisor. And they basically ran foreign policy for that period of time. They came from the realist school of foreign policy, which is the same foreign policy school that I come from. I'm a big fan of Nixon. I'm a big fan of Kissinger, both. I think they had, when it comes to American foreign policy, the Nixon era is the gold standard of American foreign policy. And one of the many brilliant foreign policy moves that Nixon was able to pull off was he pulled off a policy called détente with the Soviet Union. And détente was essentially an agreement with the Soviet Union to get the Russians to agree to respect their own sphere of influence. America basically said, hey, Eastern Europe is yours, Central Europe is yours, Cuba is yours, we will not interfere. In exchange for that, though, you cannot interfere, go fomenting revolutions in our backyard in Latin America, in Africa, in the Middle East, in Western Europe, in Southeast Asia. That's our sphere of influence. We will respect your sphere of influence if you respect our sphere of influence. And due to some other leverages that Nixon had on the Soviets, whether it was in the Middle East or with China, the Soviets basically agreed to respect the boundaries of their own empire, to say, we will not go beyond the boundaries of our own empire. We will stay within our own sphere of influence, and we will not try to expand. It was basically getting the Soviet Union to agree to no longer foment global communist revolution. I mean, it was a masterstroke, a genius masterstroke of foreign policy. However, that was only made possible because Nixon had a partner in the Soviet Union, which was Leonid Brezhnev, who was the premier of the Soviet Union at the time. And Brezhnev's views were very much shaped by his experience of World War II. Brezhnev was, to his core, someone who was fundamentally anti-war. Again, that was shaped by his experiences during World War II. He was a soldier in World War II. He suffered through the worst of the Nazi onslaught on Russia, on the Soviet Union. And just something to his core caused him to reject war, to reject conflict. Not to mention Brezhnev was incredibly corrupt, and he was much more content just living off of the corrupt spoils of the communist corruption in the Soviet Union than he was starting foreign wars elsewhere. However, détente gets blown up in 1979. Because what happens in 1979 is the Soviets invade Afghanistan. Now, Afghanistan was, at the time, a neutral country. it was not within either sphere of influence, whether the Soviet sphere or the American sphere. And it had been a neutral country for many, many years. That neutrality had gone back to the 19th century when the British controlled India and the Russians were encroaching through Central Asia. And the British fought a series of wars against the Afghans to try and secure it against the Russians, who the British were afraid that they might use Afghanistan as a corridor to then invade and take British India. And eventually there comes to an agreement that Afghanistan will forever be a neutral state and neutral buffer region between Russia in the north and British India in the south. And it stays that way. And then when the British Empire falls and India becomes independent, then it goes from Afghanistan will be a neutral buffer region between the Soviet sphere in the north and the American sphere in the south. Of course, there was no longer formal empires there, but the American sphere of influence, the capitalist Western sphere of influence in the south, the Soviet communist sphere of influence in the north. And Afghanistan would be a neutral buffer between those two states. And for a while, the Afghans actually walked this line as a neutral buffer state pretty well under their king, whose name I'm forgetting. I want to look up, actually, I want to get his name right, the king of Afghanistan. Let me see here. Last king of Muhammad Zahir Shah was his name. Muhammad Zahir Shah was the last king of Afghanistan. He actually did a very good job of walking this sort of balance beam between the West and the East, between the Soviets and the Americans. And the way he kind of walked this balance beam was he would play both sides, as a lot of these types of people did. These sort of neutral, non-aligned countries did. And how he did that was, he really wanted to modernize his country. But he did so in a pretty unique way, in a way that really worked out for him, although ultimately he was overthrown, but that was for other reasons, but I'll get to that in a moment. So Muhammad Zahir Shah basically came up with this idea where, all right, the Soviets will train our officer corps, our military equipment will come from Moscow, our military aid will come from Moscow, but when it comes to economic aid, when it comes to training our scientists and our intellectuals and our economists and our, those types of civilian intellectuals, they will all be trained in the West. And our economic aid will come from the West. And this sort of balancing act worked pretty well for many, many years. However, eventually, when Muhammad Zahir Shah, he was overseas or something like that, and he was overthrown by his cousin in just like a petty familial dispute amongst the royal family, and was overthrown in a coup. And the cousin started doubling down on this modernization in Afghanistan. Muhammad Zahir Shah wanted to modernize the country. The king of Afghanistan wanted to modernize the country, but he wanted to do so in a way that modernized the cities, but didn't upset the traditional rural lifestyles of the peasantry. The Shah of Iran had done something similar. He had modernized the country greatly, Iran had, but he had completely overthrown the traditional life of the rural peasantry in Iran. And even though, the economy was booming in Iran, the once rural peasants had essentially had their land taken from them. They couldn't compete in the farming market, so they had to move to the cities where they were crippled by inflation and non-competitive wages. And it was not difficult for them to fall into the arms of Khomeini and eventually overthrow the Shah and the Islamic Revolution in Iran. The Muhammad Zahir Shah, the king of Afghanistan, did it a little bit differently. He wanted to modernize the cities, but he pretty much left the rural peasantry, the herders, those types of people, kind of left them their own devices and their own sort of backwards religious ways, because he knew the social upheaval that would come from radically changing their lifestyles overnight. But he's eventually overthrown, replaced by his cousin, who starts really pushing rural modernization. And this starts to piss a lot of people off. It starts to piss off a lot of people in the cities, because they felt their money was being taken from them and being given to these poor rural peasants who no one gave a shit about. And so eventually, the officer corps in the Afghan army, who had all been trained in Moscow, had all been trained in Marxism and Leninism in Moscow, they decided to form a coup and they overthrow the cousin of the king who had taken power. And they form a communist government in Afghanistan in 1978. Although this does not last long because the communist leader of Afghanistan who came to power was pretty much an insane tyrant. He turned the rural population completely against him. They started taking up arms and rebelling. Even the other communists in power, hated the head honcho Afghan communist guy, and he was super oppressive and like killed them. I mean, he was like an Afghan Stalin basically. And the Soviets finally decided in 1979, we've got to go into Afghanistan. It's good they're communists. Let's keep them communist, but we got to get this crazy nut job out of there, this Stalin-esque Afghan crazy communist guy out of there, replace him with the more moderate, amiable communists, and put down this rural revolt in Afghanistan. The Soviets invade, and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, it blows up détente. All of a sudden, the Soviets, they have now gone outside of their sphere of influence. They have invaded a neutral country against the rules of détente. They had violated their own sphere of influence and gone into Afghanistan. So that blows up détente, and it puts, the Cold War had almost been on pause for that point, kind of the late 70s. There was very much a cooling down of relations between the US and the Soviet Union. But the invasion of Afghanistan, it heats the Cold War up right back again. And then, of course, Reagan is elected 2 years later in 1981. He comes to power with wants to destroy the Soviet Union. Reagan was out there to defeat and annihilate the Soviet Union. And he could point to Afghanistan and say, hey, détente failed. We have to confront these guys. We can't just trust them to remain in their own sphere of influence. These are radical communists. We have to defeat them. So this war is going on in Afghanistan. You have these mostly Islamic fundamentalist, backwards, herders, rural people who are fighting a guerrilla war against the Soviet Red Army. And America wants to get involved. Not only does America get involved, though, but the Islamic Arab powers want to get involved as well. And this sort of scheme, you should very much watch a movie called Charlie Wilson's War. It's a great movie, and it really kind of describes this whole sort of war from behind the scenes. And essentially, this scheme is formed where the U.S. Congress will put up money to purchase Soviet-made weapons from Israel and Egypt, who were the two countries that were within the Western sphere of influence that also had massive stockpiles of Soviet weapons. And the reason the Afghan fighters needed Soviet weapons was because if they were found dead with American-made weapons, then the Soviets know that the U.S. is funding them. So you wanted to support them and aid them with Soviet-made weapons so that plausibly they could be captured off of dead Soviet soldiers. So the U.S. Congress would put up money matched by the Saudis to purchase Soviet-made weapons from Egypt and Israel. They would then smuggle those weapons using mostly Arab contacts to Pakistan. Then Pakistan's intelligence service, the ISI, would smuggle those weapons across the border into Afghanistan and into the hands of the Mujahideen, who were the fundamentalist religious freedom fighters who were fighting against the Soviet Union. And it is during this Soviet-Afghan war that bin Laden becomes truly radicalized. And he sees this fight against the atheist, communist Soviet Union, trying to oppress Muslim people in their lands as a religious war, as a holy war, as a jihad. And using his wealth, using his influence in Saudi Arabia, he creates Al-Qaeda in 1988, which Al-Qaeda roughly translates to the base or the fundament, is basically what it means. And bin Laden tries to recruit Arab fighters to go over to Afghanistan and aid the Afghan Mujahideen and fight the Soviets. And he's not super successful at recruiting Arab fighters, but he does help funnel a lot of money to the Mujahideen and help in their fight against the Soviets. Eventually, Afghanistan was kind of the Soviet Union's Vietnam, and the Soviet Union is eventually forced to withdraw from Afghanistan. After the Soviets withdraw from Afghanistan, eventually the Taliban comes to power, but that happens a few years later. Once the Soviets withdraw from Afghanistan, bin Laden comes back to Saudi Arabia, And around this time, when the Soviets withdraw from Afghanistan, you have the Gulf War break out. So the Gulf War was, of course, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, conquered Kuwait, and was threatening Saudi Arabia itself. Now, bin Laden, being a patriotic Saudi citizen, being a Wahhabi Muslim, which is the fundamentalist religious sect of Islam that the Saudis believe in, versus this secular dictator in Saddam Hussein, bin Laden was all for the Gulf War. And so the Americans come in, we give Saddam an ultimatum, get out of Kuwait or else. Saddam doesn't because he was crazy and he was stupid. And we invade. We obviously kick the crap out of the Iraqis. We destroy the Iraqi army. We liberate Kuwait, and we, defend Saudi Arabia from the potential threat that Saddam posed. And bin Laden was initially a fan of this, but as the years went on, after the threat of Saddam was removed, we stayed. We left troops based in Saudi Arabia. Not only did we leave troops based in Saudi Arabia, but we also essentially blockaded Iraq. And the blockade of Iraq was brutal. Something like 500,000 civilians, children, died due to malnutrition because we had shut down Iraqi airspace. Nothing could get in, nothing could get out of the country. I mean, we were essentially strangling Iraq without actually invading the country. And there were, the economy collapsed, people starved, children starved. I think there was something like 500,000 children died in Iraq from 1991 to 2003 because of the American-led blockade of Iraq. And these things start to get bin Laden thinking. He had just played a big part in defeating the Soviet Union. And of course, their defeat in Afghanistan was a big factor that contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And he's really angry that the U.S. keeps soldiers stationed on Islamic holy land, on Saudi Arabia, the Arabian Peninsula, where the two holiest sites of Islam are located. These Christians, these infidels, or these atheist, liberal, Americans are occupying holy Islamic ground. They're killing innocent Muslim children. Sure, they might live under the dictatorship of Saddam, but they're innocent Muslims. Not to mention the United States is backing and supporting Israel, which bin Laden, as any good Muslim would, believes that Israel is a fake colonial entity. I don't happen to agree with that, but they do. And it got bin Laden thinking, there's a way that we can beat the United States, just like we beat the Soviet Union. And bin Laden comes up with what I would say was his evil genius plan. And why I say it was his evil genius plan was because, in a certain sense, it worked. It actually worked. Bin Laden did what he did, and everything that he planned would happen. It didn't happen to the degree that bin Laden thought it would happen. America was a little bit too strong than what bin Laden expected. But everything that bin Laden predicted would happen did end up happening. So what was bin Laden's evil genius plan? Well, first off, you have to understand his grievances against the United States. He had 4 major grievances. I should say actually 3 major grievances. 4 major grievances. Grievance number 1, American troops, even after the threat of Saddam was defeated, remained stationed on holy Arabian Islamic soil. They needed to go. American troops on Islamic soil, bin Laden felt that the presence of troops was not so much for defense, but more for intimidation, to keep the Islamic world down and keep them under the thumb of the United States. That was grievance number 1. Grievance number 2 was American support for Israel, which, of course, bin Laden was a big supporter of the Palestinians. He hated that Israel existed. He believed it should be wiped off the face of the earth, that Jerusalem and that the Holy Land should rightfully belong to Islam, as it had for centuries before Israel was established. It had been Islamic territory. His third major grievance was American support for secular or non-fundamentalist dictatorships throughout the region that persecuted Islamists, whether that would be in Egypt or in Saudi Arabia or in the other Gulf states or wherever. And his fourth major grievance was that blockade around Iraq. Now, of course, bin Laden was not a fan of Saddam Hussein. He saw him as a secular dictator like the Egyptians. The only thing that made him different from the Egyptians was that Saddam was an enemy of the United States. But nonetheless, the blockade of Iraq, bin Laden despised because so many people were dying in Iraq. And he felt that the blame of that was not, the blame should be placed on the Americans who had placed that blockade, not on Saddam, who remained in power and whatever, which, I happen to agree. The American blockade of Iraq was pretty brutal, and a lot of Iraqis died because of a lot of innocent Iraqis died because we were, in our attempts to punish the Saddam regime, we ended up really punishing the people of Iraq. And those were kind of his four major grievances. And eventually in 1996, bin Laden declares war on the United States. He issues a fatwa where he declares that Al-Qaeda will be going to war against the United States. And bin Laden's basic plan was this: steadily up the ante in the severity of your terror attacks. Launch terror attack after terror attack after terror attack against Americans and against American civilians. And the reason that bin Laden justified targeting American civilians was because he claimed, well, hey, America kills civilians in Iraq all day long. They kill civilians all throughout the Islamic world all the time. Their civilians are fair game too. If they're willing to kill Muslim civilians, well, it's fair game to kill American civilians for us. That was his justification for it. Obviously, evil, not condoning bin Laden in any way. He's an evil man. I hate bin Laden, but this is his justification for it. And his idea was steadily up the ante in the terror attacks against the United States to eventually provoke a response. And what bin Laden wanted to do was draw the United States, eventually launch that one big terror attack, which ended up being 9/11. Something the United States had no choice but to respond to. And in America's jingoistic fury, the United States would invade the Middle East. By invading the Middle East and occupying the Middle East, the United States would spend a fortune in treasure. Not to mention, American presence in the United States, in the Middle East, would radicalize the population against the Americans. They would see the Americans as foreign occupiers, invading their lands, and dominating their countries. And they would turn to Al-Qaeda to resist the American occupiers in a guerrilla warfare style situation. The United States would get bogged down in these guerrilla wars all throughout the United States. They would spend a fortune in doing so. And just like the Soviet Union had done in Afghanistan, eventually they would spend so much on these wars in the Middle East that it would bankrupt the United States. Their economy would collapse. And because their economy collapsed, the U.S. would have to cut off support. They would have to pull their troops out of the Middle East, and they would have to cut off their financial and military support for secular dictatorships like Saudi Arabia, like Egypt, and another secular nation like Israel, and have to remove their support from the Middle East. Combine this with the now reinvigorated and furious Al-Qaeda, which spans across the Islamic world. They could then lead a jihad, overthrowing these dictatorships who no longer have American support. They could defeat Israel, and who no longer has American support, and push the Jews into the sea. And that was basically bin Laden's evil plan. And the crazy fucking thing is, it worked. He attacked us on 9/11. And in our jingoistic fury, we said, well, we just need to kill people over there. We just need to blow shit up. And we invaded Iraq. And we got bogged down in a decades-long guerrilla war in Iraq. We got bogged down in a decades-long guerrilla war in Afghanistan. We spent trillions in the Middle East, and we did bankrupt ourselves, and our economy did collapse in 2008. No thanks in large part to the massive military spending that took place after 9/11. Now, where bin Laden was wrong was the United States is not the Soviet Union. And the United States economy, as close to the brink as we were in 2008, was able to partially recover. I will eventually do a whole video on the 2008 financial crisis and the corruption and how disgusting too big to fail was and the bailouts were and the stimulus that came after and how just corrupt it was. But even despite all that corruption, even despite the disaster that was 2008, the United States economy was still so strong that even despite that horrible blow to it, we were able to absorb that blow and we were able to overcome it. And we were, eventually we were forced to pull out of the Middle East. But, today, hey, Israel still exists. There's a friendly secular dictator that controls Egypt. The Saudi royal family is just as strong as ever. America in general, I would say, is as strong as it's ever been in the Middle East. Israel is still very much a thing and not going anywhere anytime soon. But bin Laden was correct in that attacking us on 9/11 would draw us into a series of guerrilla wars in the Middle East, and that would bankrupt us and it would collapse our economy. Where he was wrong was we're not the Soviet Union. Our economy, our nation, were a much, much, much stronger than the Soviet system was. Our capitalist system could take blows like that and still somewhat recover and continue on to this day. Now, there's a lot of problems, obviously, in our economy, but America still exists, and we can still support our foreign allies very, very well, and probably in some ways better than we ever have before. Of course, bin Laden, after this all takes place, we finally found him in his compound in Abbottabad, and we took him out in Pakistan. But I think kind of why I want to make this video is because really what I wanted to do a deep dive on was not just 9/11. I mean, we all know the story of 9/11. The hijackers took the planes, they flew them into the towers, thousands of people died. It was an American tragedy, the worst terror attack in American history. But I kind of wanted to go through and just upset kind of some of the notions that we think of bin Laden. Again, this guy was not, do not think of him as the caricature that he is portrayed as. Bin Laden was an evil genius. He was a Bond villain, okay? This was an educated, highly intelligent, evil genius. And his plan worked. It didn't work to the extent that he believed it would. America is not going anywhere. But if he wanted to provoke an American reaction, get us bogged down in guerrilla wars in the Middle East, and because we spent so much money on that, our economy would collapse at home. That all happened. It all happened. I mean, it all went perfectly according to bin Laden's plan. Not totally perfectly, because he felt that the U.S. would completely collapse like the Soviet Union did. Obviously, that didn't happen. But to a degree, it did. And I think if there's anything to take away from this, it is that not only should you not believe the caricature of bin Laden, but you should think of bin Laden as so much worse than you currently do. Because he was not some backwards barbarian. He was an evil genius. And his evil plan worked almost perfectly. And not only did it result in the thousands that died on 9/11, it resulted in the countless millions more killed in the global war on terror. It resulted in the financial collapse of 2008, which in many ways we have not even recovered from. I will do a video on 2008 later on. He's so much worse than we really believe. He did so much more damage to this country than we really think of. I mean, 9/11 was just the beginning of the damage that bin Laden did to this country. It was just the tip of the spear. Everything that came after it, it all went perfectly according to bin Laden's plan. And we are still feeling the ramifications of the global war on terror, of the financial crisis of 2008, of all of these things that were all sparked by bin Laden. We had this unipolar moment in the 1990s after the fall of the Soviet Union, where we were the sole superpower, and to a degree we still are. But bin Laden set the stage to take us down from that level. And we still haven't gone up to that level from what we were after the fall of the Soviet Union, during that unipolar moment when we were the sole superpower. So that is kind of my message for a little history deep dive tonight. I wanted to do a little talk on 9/11. I mean, this wasn't really on 9/11. It was much more on bin Laden specifically than it was 9/11. But I wanted to do one of those. I'm going to do one of these every night. One show a week. I'm going to do more of a history-centric show than a current events show. That was for this week. Again, I missed 9/11 last week. I just started doing this on Friday last week, a day after 9/11. And I just wanted to talk about it a little bit tonight. So I hope you enjoyed it tonight. I'm going to be wrapping it up tonight. But yeah, I hope y'all enjoyed it. I hope y'all have a great evening. Good night.